All right, well, thank you everyone very much for joining us today. My name is Callum McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Labor Market Intelligence with Tourism HR Canada. I am recording this session. It's a pre-recorded session, but I am live in the chat. So you will be able to ask me questions as we go through the presentation, and hopefully I will be able to answer as best I can. Today we're going to be discussing the likely post-COVID future of the tourism sector. We're going to be looking at it from an economic perspective, how it's been impacted from an economic perspective, and in turn, how the workforce has been impacted, and what that's likely to lead to as we look forward to a reopening and rebuilding phase this summer, knowing that, of course, there's still a lot of volatility out there. Today's presentation is about 45 minutes in length. At the end of the presentation, we will be posing 3 open-ended questions to you, so we can in turn gather your feedback that will help inform the research we've been conducting to help the tourism sector recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The presentation is going to draw on data being collected by an ongoing research project that we're working on. That is hoping to identify the most likely scenario the tourism sector is going to find itself in as vaccination efforts ramp up and we look at the rebuilding of the visitor economy starting this summer, with all those caveats that there are a lot of unknowns still in play. The aim of this study was to look at Tourism HR Canada's collected research on tourism employment issues, as well as research from other sources, and produce a report that synthesizes and summarizes all of that research and therefore uses it to predict the future challenges, particularly on the employment front, that the sector is going to face. That said, we wanted to make sure that we examine the broader economic, social, and political factors that are going to affect the sector and its workers. We didn't want to look at employment just on its own, in its own silo. Based on the information we are collecting, we're developing an overview of tourism strengths and weaknesses from an employment perspective, both prior to and since the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. The research is going to identify the largest challenges that are going to affect their ability to continue to grow the tourism sector, and explain how those challenges could potentially hinder the development of the tourism sector as an economic driver. That said, it's also going to look at solutions to those challenges and make recommendations about ways to overcome them. As part of this research, we conducted a series of online consultation sessions with employers, employees, and other tourism stakeholders. And today's presentation covers the data that we drew on going into those consultation sessions, as well as some of the preliminary outcomes from the consultation sessions themselves. Just to start, I want to cover the scope of the analysis we were undertaking and the definition of tourism that we use to define that scope. Tourism as a sector is incredibly diverse, and I'm going to talk about the tourism recovery and rebuilding, but that's actually going to gloss over the fact, that term actually glosses over the fact that there's going to be various levels of recovery and rebuilding within the sector, depending on geography and depending on industry. Tourism HR Canada's mandate deals with employment. So just to start, because it's linked to this idea of defining tourism, I just want to touch on the fact that there are often 2 tourism job numbers out there that you may have seen. There is the 750,000 tourism jobs number and the 1.9 million tourism jobs number. Now, the language used to describe both of those does get used interchangeably. Often it's simply called tourism jobs. But proper technical definition is that one is counting the number of jobs in Canada that are attributable to tourism demand. In other words, the number of jobs that are supported by tourists spending money to buy goods and services at tourism businesses. And in 2019, there were about 750,000 jobs in Canada attributed to tourism demand. The 1.9 million jobs number measures all of the jobs that exist in all 5 tourism industry groups. So accommodation, food and beverage services, recreation and entertainment, transportation and travel services, regardless of whether those jobs are being supported by tourist demand or not. Tourism demand comes, of course, from tourists, and tourism, that's defined as the activities of people traveling to and staying in places outside of their usual environment for leisure, business, or other purposes for not more than one consecutive year. The 750,000 number is incredibly important because it's a measure of the economic importance of tourists to Canada and the number of jobs that are being supported by that activity. But tourism businesses do not just serve tourists. When you go to a restaurant or a nearby ski hill, or if you go to a museum within your own community, you're spending money there, you're supporting jobs within the tourism industry, but you're a local, you are not a tourist. The 1.9 million jobs number is also very important because it captures the full scope of employment within the tourism sector. And in 2019, before the start of the pandemic, there were 1.9 million full year jobs in the tourism sector. It's important to measure both. And from a recovery aspect, the 1.9 million jobs number is incredibly important because, of course, the initial recovery, a lot of it is going to be dependent on activity by locals. As you can see here, the tourism industries are defined as industries that would either cease to exist or would exist at a significantly reduced level of activity in the absence of tourism. And different industries within the tourism sector have a different mix of demand from tourists and from locals. And of course, this matters because it's going to impact when recovery starts for different industries and how quickly they can start to recover. Of course, if you look at this from an industry level perspective, it can look very different for a specific business within an industry, or sometimes even within some industries within industry groups. Just to look at this, of course, recreation and entertainment and the restaurant industry, they tend to get a large majority of their demand from locals. However, a quarter of their revenue still comes from tourists. On the other side, you have the hotel industry and the travel services industry, which gets the majority, in one case, the very large majority of their revenue from tourist activities. Then you have something like the transportation industry. Now, as an industry group, transportation only gets 36% of its demand from tourism. But if you break that down, there are a number of specific industries. Air transportation within transportation industry group gets the majority of its demand from tourists. The taxi and limo industry gets the majority of its demand from locals. Both are still very important to the tourism sector as a whole. But the point being here is that once we start to see a permanent relaxation of health restrictions and stay-at-home orders, that's the beginning of the recovery for some businesses. Golf courses, at least the ones that cater to locals, they fall within the recreation and entertainment industry. They can offer their services at that point. Restaurants with their large patios, they can do so as well. And they were able to manage, at least as best they could, under those conditions last summer. As social distancing guidelines are reduced and removed, then indoor dining capacity can be lifted, as can restrictions on the number of people attending a museum, for example. But the hotels and the travel services industry, and then some of those transportation industries, they're still languishing. They're still waiting for travel to restart before their recovery begins. You also need to consider the mix of domestic demand and international demand that each industry group draws on. Domestic travel within Canada is going to happen before international travelers return in large numbers. So those industries that get most of their demand from domestic tourists have a bit of a head start. Now, that said, there's probably not going to be a lot of travel outside of Canada in the near future. So Canadians may do more domestic traveling, which for a industry like the hotel industry, they may be able to tap into that and increase their share of demand coming from the domestic market and offset some of that demand that they're missing from the international market. Now, complicating factors a little bit here, you'll see that travel services, they get a lot of their demand from domestic tourism, according to the statistics. That's a little bit of misleading, and I put an asterisk for purpose because the travel services industry, the travel agencies are in Canada selling travel packages to Canadians. So that purchase, the fee that goes to the travel agencies, counts as domestic tourism, but of course, the purchase is often for travel outside of Canada. So for them, until that international travel starts again, the impact could be somewhat minimal. And timing matters too. This comes from the National Tourism Indicators. This data from 2019 really shows that the plurality of tourism spending occurs in July, August, and September. that summer month is a key time frame for tourism businesses to get a lot of their revenue in the door. Not all, of course, but many. And all of this is going to matter in terms of how the recovery and rebuild will progress. And it's important to take this into account when talking about tourism recovery, because it's going to start. Tourism recovery is starting. We're entering that phase now. But the messaging around this needs to convey that just because the tourism sector recovery has started, it's not progressing at the same pace for all industries or for all businesses. Geography is going to be important too, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. But from a policy perspective, it's important to remember that just because one industry may really start to get back on its feet this summer does not mean that all industries within tourism or all tourism businesses are doing the same. So let's move to the economic impact. This is looking at data on the current state of the sector. This data comes from STR, which measures the overall occupancy rates at hotels in Canada. Of course, very clear there in March, before the outbreak of the pandemic. That's a low point in the tourism travel season. Occupancy was sitting somewhere just above 55% each week, plunged to almost nothing in April before slowly recovering over the summer and then going back down again. Right now, towards the start of February, occupancy rates were sitting somewhere just below 30%, which is down for that time of year, and even over the summer, occupancy rates were well below what would normally be expected. This is also the overall occupancy rate for Canada as a whole, for Canadian hotels as a whole. And we do know that occupancy rates are even lower in urban areas than they are outside the urban centers. Food service sales also took a significant hit in April. Each month, there's about somewhere between $5 billion to $6.5 billion, or at least there were billions of dollars worth of food service sales each month. With the start of the pandemic, many restaurants were forced to close. They had not been able to take on online ordering at that point in time, and sales dropped to about $2.5 billion in the month of April before starting to climb back over the summer. But again, much like the hotel occupancy rates, even though it came back over the summer, it was nowhere near what it would be expected during those summer months. And going into October and November, food service sales have declined again, somewhere to just over $4 billion in sales in November, with, of course, more restrictions being put in place that month, and then into December and January, we expect those numbers to continue to decline. Similar story with airline passengers, but perhaps even a bit more extreme. Passenger numbers, in April, May were down 94% from 2019 levels, and there's again a slight recovery over the summer, but really comparatively to last year, air passenger numbers are all but non-existent. So a lot less economic activity clearly shows that tourism is the hardest hit sector. And I think this particular slide is particularly good at showing this, because this is the monthly gross domestic product by industry across Canada. And overall gross domestic product economic activity is down for the economy as a whole. What we did here is different industries have different sizes. So of course they have different levels or different amounts of gross domestic product. So what we did is we took the level in January, set that to 100, and compared each month to January, relatively speaking. Of course, there was the dip in April and May. Right now, gross domestic product as of December in Canada for the economy as a whole is about 97% of where it was in January at the start of the year, or the start of last year, I should say. For tourism as a whole, we're sitting at about 60% gross domestic product relative to January. So a decline of over 40% as of December. And again, you're seeing different rates by different industries in tourism, but everything is down across the board. Now, I've only shown some of the industries here, but just for example, food services sitting at about 63% of gross domestic product relative to January. The accommodation, the hotel industry, basically down by half. And air transport, as you might imagine, based on that last slide, very low at 12% of what it was in January of 2020. And the number of active tourism businesses has declined as well. Active tourism businesses are defined as those businesses that have at least one employee in a given month. and prior to the pandemic, the number of active tourism businesses was running somewhere around 80,000 each month, taking into account seasonal openings, closures, businesses going out of businesses, new businesses being opened up. But there was kind of a constant churn sitting around 80,000. Of course, there was a steep decline in April and May, but then some of these businesses did start to open up again. As of November, we still have a decline, though, of 9%. There are 9% fewer active tourism businesses than there were in January of 2020. Now, the one thing to mention with this data, it doesn't allow us to determine if a business is simply temporarily closed or if they're permanently closed. So we don't know what mix is in that 9% there. The other thing to point out here is this is going up to November. That was the month in which many Canadian provinces really started to implement significant restrictions in response to the second wave of COVID. We saw Manitoba introducing restrictions in November, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and some other provinces more so in December, and continuing through January. So we expect the number of active businesses to continue to go on a decline again for the coming months. And in terms of, as I said, there's differences by industry depending on how you break out tourism. Travel services industry, in terms of the number of active businesses, has been hit the hardest, far and away, relative to any other industry. The number of active businesses in travel services is down 31%. The transportation segment of tourism is the second hardest hit, down 12%. Tourism overall, 9%, as I mentioned. Food and beverage services, recreation, entertainment, the only segment of tourism where they hadn't seen quite as many businesses going inactive is actually in the accommodation sector, which is interesting because in terms of employment, they've been one of the hardest hit, but they have managed to keep more businesses active. That being said, it's all relative. A decline of 4% is very significant. And in terms of what the outlook is going forward, we actually just completed a survey of tourism businesses. There were 900 businesses included in the survey. And as you can see from the data, this was collected in January and February. It found that over 60% of responding businesses has had to lay off staff due to COVID restrictions that were put in place this winter. It also found that under current conditions, almost a quarter of businesses can only sustain operation for 6 to 12 months before they are at serious risk of permanent closure. Now that puts them in a position to potentially take advantage of a reopening that occurs in early summer. But over a quarter of the responding businesses said they couldn't even last 6 months under current economic conditions. Despite that, when comparing staffing reductions and revenue reductions, we can see that businesses are holding on to staff to a greater extent than their revenue declines would suggest. 48% of responding businesses said they're making 0 to 25% of their usual revenue for this time of year, while about 40% had staffing levels that were 0 to 25% of normal levels. On the other end of the scale, about 12% of responding businesses said that they had revenue that was 75% to 100% of what they would expect, whereas 30% of businesses were keeping their staffing levels in that 75% to 100% of normal range. That suggests that there is an impact from support systems like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, helping to keep some workers employed despite the lack of revenue. We also think that we know that businesses are also holding on to a core group of staff in order to keep the businesses running, even if they're doing so at a loss. And the economic impacts have certainly had a significant knock-on effect onto the workforce as well. And it's pretty clear right here. Prior to the pandemic, there were 2 million Canadians employed in tourism. In the next 2 months, almost 900,000 tourism workers lost that employment. Now, there was a regrowth of employment as things did open up going into the summer. Restrictions were lifted, some travel did occur, but we never got back anywhere close to what employment levels you would expect for the summer months. And certainly it's been on a decline since then. Jump forward to January of 2021, the last month for which we have data, and there were only 1.4 million Canadians still working in the tourism sector, which is almost 500,000, more than 500,000 fewer than there were a year ago at this time. The unemployment rate, of course, has gone up as employment has gone down. As of January, we've reached an unemployment rate of 18.6% in the tourism sector, compared to a very high unemployment rate in the economy overall of 9.8%. One thing to note here, the unemployment rates are a bit of a trailing indicator, and the situation with COVID-19 is making this data a little, it's messing it up a little, basically. In order to be considered unemployed, you need to be actively seeking work. And of course, with all of the disruption, the shutdowns, a lot of people, when they lose employment, are not immediately seeking work. So it's a little bit, so the unemployment rate doesn't necessarily say it's obviously very bad, but it doesn't quite indicate how bad things are out there. And in terms of what's happening right now, I mean, tourism demand is essentially non-existent at this point in time. There's not a lot of, there's no international tourism, or very, very little. Domestic tourism is muted. So right now, what we're seeing in the most recent months, the employment data is really being driven by restrictions that affect businesses at a local level and impact the ability of locals to go and spend money at those businesses. It's those health restrictions in response to the second wave. We can clearly see this if we look at some specific provinces. Manitoba, of course, they lost a lot of employment in the early months of the pandemic, came back over the summer, but going into October and then in November was when Manitoba implemented a shutdown and employment dropped to 23%. Nova Scotia, the restrictions, the severe restrictions there were implemented in December, particularly affecting the Halifax regional municipality. Employment dropped 20%. Ontario, a little bit of a different story, because there was kind of ongoing implementation of restrictions in some regions, then pullbacks, and then more restrictions implemented. Ottawa was in a very restricted place in November, came out of it, and then the entire province went back into restrictions or severe restrictions late December. So there was a bit of an ongoing decline in employment, but then when those province-wide restrictions were implemented late December, you really saw the employment crash in January, down 14%. Regardless, the story in terms of employment levels is very negative. The workforce has been severely impacted. We can see this by looking at the year-over-year annual data for employment, which helps kind of even out some of those ups and downs that occur month to month. So this looks at average employment within the tourism sector by province in 2019 and 2020. And as you can see, a number of provinces are down almost 30%. Saskatchewan and Prince Edward Island have lost the most employment on a year-over-year basis. New Brunswick has lost over 10% of employment, and it's doing the best in terms of employment out of any of the provinces. And the tourism unemployment rate, in turn, this is again the annual tourism unemployment rate. Overall, the annual unemployment rate for the entire Canadian economy last year was 9.5%. That's higher than it was during the financial crisis when it was 8.4%. The unemployment rate for tourism was 16.5%, and by industry ranged from 9.7% in transportation all the way up to 22.4% in the accommodation industry. So we've seen employment decline and in turn unemployment spike upwards, but I would mention that it could have been much, much worse. A great deal of what employment there is being supported by the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy. Now, we do not have tourism sector level data for the number of employees who are on queues, but we can look at sector level data, publicly available sector level data for the accommodation and food services industry and the arts and entertainment and recreation sectors, and use those as proxies. As you can see, the peak use of queues was July for accommodation and food services, and in August for the arts, entertainment and recreation sector. At its peak, over 700,000 workers in accommodation and food services had their wages being subsidized by queues, over 100,000 in the arts, entertainment and recreation sector. Now, that number of workers who are being supported by that program has dropped significantly since the summer months, but it remains in the hundreds of thousands. And in terms of what industries are utilizing the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, the accommodation and food service industry is well ahead. Tourism has been the hardest hit sector of the economy, and one of tourism's strengths was the diversity of our workforce. Compared to the entire economy, tourism had a higher share of jobs held by women, young people, visible minorities, immigrants, and Indigenous workers. But because of the negative economic consequences that have fallen on this sector and the knock-on effects onto the workforce, business closures, employment losses, all of this has fallen most heavily on these groups as well. And much like when I spoke about the recovery, the different recovery levels for industry groups, the demographic profile of the different industries is going to affect the recovery outlook for these workers. The percentage of jobs held by women across industries range from a very high amount in travel services. Over 70% of jobs in that industry group were held by women, 63% or 60% in the accommodation sector, and almost 60% in food and beverage services. Share of jobs held by immigrants, again, that's also much higher in the travel services, accommodation, and transportation industries. And the percentage of jobs held by visible minorities tends to be higher, again, travel services, food and beverage services, and the accommodation industry. And so again, that you need to take into account those recovery scenarios for each industry group when thinking about how best to help support people who have lost their jobs, because these groups have been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of employment. We also know that through the research done by the Conference Board of Canada for the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada, that there's been a devastating impact on employment within the Indigenous tourism sector. They have seen a dramatic loss of direct employment and gross domestic product due to the impact of COVID-19. Comparing, they looked at 2019 and 2020 and found that there was a loss of 65.9% of gross domestic product within the Indigenous tourism sector, and an equivalent 60% decline in employment, loss of almost 14,000 jobs in that sector. And that is only looking at the Indigenous tourism sector itself. It does not look at the employment of Indigenous workers at non-Indigenous tourism businesses. As employment has declined, of course, so has job postings. This is just another piece of data to kind of support show the impact that has happened on the workforce. Job postings for travel counselors, so the travel services industry, were down the most, almost over 72%, over 70% on a year-over-year basis. Transportation industry jobs were also down significantly. Postings for cooks, food and beverage servers, down 30%. Light duty cleaners was actually up slightly. A bit of nuance to that story, of course. Those include housekeepers within the hotel industry, which demand for that particular job is down. But because of COVID-19 protocols, overall, there's a demand for light duty cleaners, and those has caused the job postings to go up slightly. We also know that how the workforce feels about the tourism sector has suffered significantly. I get into this in much more detail in my presentation on sentiments toward tourism, but the overall story is one in which the workforce has a more negative view of the industry than prior to COVID-19. They have less desire to work in the industry. Their perceptions of personal health and safety have taken a hit. Their personal feelings of comfort while at work are more negative, and not surprisingly, based on the data I've just been showing you and what we just all know is happening in the tourism sector, their feeling of job security in the industry has plummeted. We've also seen a decline in our labor force. Now, the labor force is the combined number of people employed in the tourism sector, as well as former tourism workers who are looking for jobs. Now, in March and April, it went down, and that's because, of course, many people lost employment, but because of the circumstances at the time, they did not necessarily immediately start looking for new work and were therefore not considered unemployed. Labor force grew back over the summer months, but the story since then has been a slow and ongoing decline in the labor force. Basically, now we always expect a bit of a decline in September when students go back to work, when students go back to school, because if they're back in school, they aren't necessarily looking for work. usually plateaus in October. There's basically two possibilities here. Former tourism workers are finding work in another industry, or they are not actively seeking work, which would be reasonable, again, considering that we're into the second wave over the winter. But we don't actually know entirely which of those two categories they're falling into. Overall, we do know that employment is still down. It's not as if there's been a flood of people going into other industries. Only a few sectors have more employed workers than they did at the start of the pandemic. And a large number of people remain unemployed. On this slide, the blue bars show the seasonally adjusted number of employment insurance beneficiaries during the height of the financial crisis, so 2009. At peak, just over 1 million people a month received EI benefits back then. At the start of the pandemic, the number of EI beneficiaries started to go upwards. It then went down because of the introduction of the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, the CERB, which acted as a substitute for EI and covered a broader swath of those affected by COVID-19. Now, that came to an end in September. There was a revamped version of employment insurance that was introduced, and many transferred from CERB onto EI. And of course, the number of beneficiaries went up much higher than it had been during the height of the financial crisis. In addition to EI, there were a number of programs that carried on from the CERB. They were kind of CERB-like. And if you are getting employment insurance, you're not eligible for these programs. There's the Canadian Recovery Benefit, there's the Canadian Recovery Sickness Benefit, and the Canadian Recovery Caregiving Benefit. Now, we don't have data on how many individuals are currently on each of those programs, but we do know the number of unique applicants for those programs. And as you can see, beyond EI, there's also a big demand for these programs. So there's not just EI, but a lot of other people who are out of work on these programs, hopefully looking to return to work at some point in time. There's two factors in competition here. There are a large number of people currently out of work and they're waiting to get back to their jobs. Many of them are former tourism workers, and there will be jobs there for them as the visitor economy reopens. But with a negative impact on perceptions, the question is, how willing will they be to come back? And could tourism demand ramp up more quickly than we can re-employ or bring back former workers? And if they do come back, will they stay? As we move into the summer, it's going to be incredibly important to continue to retain the remaining workforce that we have, recruit back former tourism workers. We also need to recognize that many businesses are going to remain in weak financial shape because of the impact of COVID-19. Support like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy is going to be incredibly important if businesses are to continue to exist through the early stages of rebuilding. So where are we headed into this summer? Well, it really comes down to vaccination. Currently, rates are not particularly high, with the exception of the territories who've gotten a bit of a lead on the provinces. It's really vaccination that's really going to tell us or allow us to begin an ongoing recovery and rebuilding phase. Right now, in people's mind, there's still a question: is there going to be another wave? We have seen in Ontario, for example, some regions that were released from the province-wide restrictions. They've had restrictions relaxed, but then had to have them some more severe restrictions put back in place. Until a point comes where the percentage of Canadians who are vaccinated, plus, of course, the kind of lower transmissibility levels that we saw last summer with social distancing and other protocols put in place. Once that, we have to offset that with the fact that there are more contagious variants circulating. But at some point, there's going to be a tipping point where enough people are vaccinated that there is an ongoing sustained decline in transmission rates. And that's really when the rebuilding of the tourism sector can really start to take hold. Now, the news here has been a bit mixed. Early on, the news on Canadian vaccination rates and outlook for vaccination December, January, February was not particularly good. In fact, just a week ago when I recorded my presentation on sentiments, Ontario was only expecting to roll out vaccinations for anyone who wanted a vaccine in August. It's just a week later, there's been more vaccines approved. Now they're talking about June, end of June, for getting the needle into the arm of anyone who wants a vaccine, at least their first injection. And of course, late spring, early summer is going to be a lot better for the tourism sector than late summer because of that summer window when the plurality of tourism spending occurs. Regardless, until we're not likely to see a lot of restrictions lift, and even then, even if they are lifted, there might be some hesitancy on the part of Canadians to engage in certain activities. A Leger survey from early March found that 14% of Canadians want to lift restrictions right now, but the plurality, 31%, believe restrictions should not be lifted until all Canadians have received the required dose of vaccine. In fact, 18% are even more hesitant. They say we should wait 6 months until after that has occurred before lifting restrictions. That said, Canadians are sick and tired of being at home. This comes from Destination Canada's Global Tourism Watch, as well as Leger's Comfort with Activities survey. 80% of Canadians say when restrictions are relaxed, they want to get out and travel. 65% said once restrictions are lifted, they're going to be comfortable dining in a restaurant. Fewer are going to be comfortable flying on a plane or attending a large gathering, which speaks again to that different pace of recovery for different industries. Still, this gives us a kind of an indication of when we can expect a sustained rebuild of the sector to start. Keeping in mind that industries that get more demand from locals will rebound first, followed by those that tap domestic tourists, and then those reliant on international travel or outbound Canadian travelers going to be the last to recovery. However, I do want to talk about 3 trends that are going to affect the recovery from a geographical perspective. First is work from home. Lots of restaurants, pubs, etc., they get their demand from locals who are at downtown offices. And of course, right now there's a business survey of Canadian Intentions Business Survey showed that 30% of businesses say that post-pandemic, at least half of their workers are going to continue to work from home. And of course, many jobs can't be done from home. Construction, manufacturing, many jobs in the tourism sector itself, which means a lot of that is going to be concentrated in the office workers who are in turn concentrated in our downtown cores. That does mean that the impact of the pandemic that has had on those coffee shops, restaurants, and pubs in those regions will not necessarily lift just as restrictions do. The other trend to be aware of is business travel. Business travel historically recovers more slowly than leisure travel following economic downturns, and this one is going to be no exception. This also is going to affect the urban cores, this time impacting hotels as well as the restaurants. It also has an impact on the airport hotels and the conference centers, as well as the transportation industry itself. Video conferencing tools, other digital tools, these create cost savings for businesses. They can also reduce their carbon footprint. And so this is going to have an impact on how quickly business travel returns. The Conference Board of Canada's Tourism Market Outlook shows demand for business travel still below 2019 levels all the way out in 2024. A study by McKinsey Consulting estimated that 20% of business travel in the US, not Canada, but still, may simply not return. And going into the summer, we also have to look at where people are planning to travel. We've seen headlines like unprecedented demand for cottage rentals this summer. This comes from the this data comes from the National Tourism Indicators, which kind of supports that contention that we're going to see a lot of travel in rural and remote regions this summer. Now, this data is from last year, June, July, and August. The National Tourism Indicators measure expenditures in various areas of the tourism sector. Overall, demand was down. Convention fees down, travel services down, food and beverage services down. The only area that was in increase, and a significant increase year over year, was pre-trip expenditures. And this was spending on things like motorhomes, tents, trailers, camping equipment, all the equipment you need to go and travel outdoors. So as this plays out, we're likely to see significant increases in demand in some regions of Canada as people look to get out of the cities and travel in outdoor regions where they can spread out and be comfortable feeling that they can engage in activities in a safe manner. Now, I don't want to suggest that this will be true of all rural areas or all small communities. You could see there could be very acute labor shortages and very acute demand spikes in some regions. Well, it could miss others entirely. There could be regions that have some underutilized capacity. At the same time, others are seeing, aren't able to meet all of the demand from tourists coming to their region. There's going to be a real demand or a real need this summer for real-time regional data to understand how this is playing out over the summer months. Last year's National Tourism Indicators data can kind of show us that it's likely coming, but does not allow us to see these demand spikes happening in real time. So in February, we presented some of the same information I presented today to employers and employees and sought further feedback. Now we're in the process of pulling the data from those sessions together, but here are some of the preliminary results. It's still early days. We know that we're going to start ramping up with the vaccinations as it spreads out. We're going to need to get businesses back open and workers back into jobs. Now that won't happen at the same pace in every region, in every industry, but it will happen. So the question becomes, how do we get workers back? We know the perceptions of work in tourism are more negative now. So we asked employers and employees, how can we get employees back into the tourism workforce? There were many suggestions, but the key recommendations were to improve job security, increase pay, and show that there are career pathways that workers can follow. There are career pathways, but often workers have a hard time seeing them. Now, admittedly, all of these are significant challenges at a time when the industry is weakened and is only now preparing to rebuild following the pandemic. What do businesses need in order to ramp up for reopening? There was a key focus here on increased training opportunities, both for workers and for employers. Cross-training was important. Workers need to be flexible right now. Many cases, businesses have a core staff who are doing a bit of everything. And there was a sense that this was going to continue even as the reopening occurred. Everybody needs to be able to do any job at any time. There's also demand for training on COVID safety protocols, customer service, and safely managing conflict, as well as supports for mental health and well-being. Participants also noted that there was a need for funding to support the implementation of this type of training and well-being supports, as well as protocols needed to deal with employees and customers who are not vaccinated or refuse to vaccinate. And what supports are needed for businesses to adapt to the uncertainty as the visitor economy is rebuilt? Well, one, of course, was a big call for marketing. Let people know that they can get out, that they can travel. When it is safe to do so, let them know that they can go out, spend money at businesses here in Canada, help those businesses recover. There was a need for ongoing financial support. There is still a fair amount of uncertainty. This recovery is going to happen at different speeds. And although we've been talking about recovery starting this summer, and for the sector that's true, not for all industries, not necessarily for all businesses. And even for those that do start to see their recovery happen this summer, they're still carrying a burden of operating for over a year now with very significant restrictions that have hurt them financially. Despite all the support in place, there has been a lot of support. It's helped them to survive, but the continuation of that support as we enter that recovery phase is going to be vital. We also heard about the need to expand and continue product development. In response to COVID, many businesses came up with very unique and innovative product offerings that people could engage in while socially distancing and being safe. A lot of creative energy was put into this, and it was emphasized that there's been a chance to improve and tweak these for the coming summer. And so there's, even with restrictions still in place to a degree, people can still get out, they can travel, they can engage in activities and enjoy themselves in a safe manner. It was also emphasized that don't get rid of these once the pandemic has passed. These products and services will be of interest even in the post-COVID era. And finally, clear messaging. From a planning and preparation perspective, the constant change in expectations and messages has made it difficult. It's understandable that that's been the case, but it's better to know that a shutdown will last 2 months and be clear about that than be given updates every 2 weeks and be uncertain. As we move into the recovery phase, there needs to be clear messaging on timelines for reopening and the protocols that are expected of businesses. Clarity over uncertainty. So our research is not yet fully complete, but preliminarily we are looking at the following for the summer of 2021. Demand for safe activities is going to continue. Social distancing regulations will continue in the medium term, and even once lifted, Canadians are still going to be somewhat cautious. Demand for domestic and outdoor tourism will remain heightened. Some small communities and rural areas could see significant benefit from this. There's also a potential that they could have difficulty meeting all of the demand that is expected of them. International and business tourism will be slow to recover. In fact, it will be negligible this year. And to capture how all of this is playing out regionally and by industry, there's a real need for real-time, up-to-date information. That's going to be incredibly important to assess how the recovery goes so we can make adjustments and move forward. And finally, the workers are going to exercise some caution about working in tourism. Negative sentiment towards the industry has been increased because of the pandemic. There are going to be mixed levels of demand for worker by region and industry this year. And not only will the recovery look different for different businesses, depending on their location and their industry, but the same is true for those who have been impacted by the employment losses. All that said, we are moving out of the worst of the crisis. For the sector as a whole, the recovery and rebuilding phase is around the corner. It will be challenging and a great deal of support is still needed, but we are moving towards a post-COVID future. Which brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for joining. I hope I've been able to answer all of your questions that may have been sent my way in the chat function. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the Labour Market Forum, it's about presenting information, but it's also about gathering feedback from industry stakeholders. I've been presenting some of the preliminary findings and data from our research, but it is still ongoing. And to that end, a link has been posted in the chat. It will take you to 3 open-ended questions that are related to this topic. We've given you 15 minutes, although you've got as much time as you want really, to give us your thoughts on how we can help the tourism sector recover and rebuild as we move into the summer of 2021. I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts, and with that, I will thank you very much for joining me today. Have a good day, everyone.